The title of my lesson, as most of you have seen, is, Hey, didn't you get the pictures I sent? Well, obviously that's taken from a perspective of God looking at some of the things that we do and some of the ways that we behave, and He's indicating that He sent something forward that we should have already seen and understood about it. Well, Jesus faced that certainly as He was here in person and trying to reveal things to them, fulfilling all the prophecies, and yet they missed it all and didn't see it. And I fear that in many ways that we're the same, that we miss things when there were clear pictures sent forward. Now, granted, the only way that we're going to find out a lot of those things is if we get into God's Word. And we don't have the benefit of having been raised in a Jewish culture, certainly in an ancient culture where things were much different, and in an Asian culture, Eastern culture. And so a lot of the references in the Scriptures and the circumstances, we just have a hard time relating to because we just don't understand. And so my advice, particularly to young preachers, but it applies to all of us, is learn as much as you can about their culture. Learn as much as you can about history, their history, because the references in the Scriptures, that's where they're taken from. And you can get those life settings and those things that will enhance your message, the more of that you know. When I'm studying a passage, I look for every commentary I can get. Not for doctrine. I don't need their theology, but I need their history. I need all the recordings of culture and what they did in this kind of circumstance and that kind of circumstance, and all that helps us to understand so that we can better unfold the gospel to those that we have the privilege to preach to. Before I get into my actual lesson, I want to read one verse out of Matthew in the 11th chapter. First verse, it says, "And it came to pass, when Jesus had made an end of commanding his 12 disciples, he departed thence to teach and to preach." Now notice he used two words, to teach and to preach. And the more I studied that, certainly most of us know what the difference of those is, and there is a difference. There is a difference between teaching and preaching, and I say that because we've gathered here at a minister's school, and we're teaching lessons. Some of the subjects and some of the information and things that we discuss, it may not be something that you would want to stand and preach on, but certainly it's something you ought to teach on. And if we looked up the definitions, and I looked them up in Thayer, and the definition for preach is to be a herald, to officiate as a herald, an official messenger bringing news. Now, when we go to preach, that's what we do. We're getting up to herald a message and to bring news to people. We may not start and build up to it or even build around it, but we're declaring a message. And, of course, teaching is to impart instruction, to instill doctrine into one, to teach, to explain or expound a thing. And when you look at the passage that I just read about Jesus, said that he began to both teach and preach. So I followed those words through, and I could find 9 instances in the New Testament where it says that Jesus preached. But I found 41 instances where it said he taught. And so if we're going to be like Jesus, we're going to do a lot more teaching than we do preaching. And that's why we're pastors of churches, is because we need to preach to the lost, but we need to teach the sheep. We need to teach the flock. And I think that some of you would probably agree with me that many of our churches, that they're dying out for a lack of teaching. Lots of preaching to the lost, but we can't preach to the lost every Sunday morning. We certainly can't every Wednesday night or Sunday night when we have Bible study. We've got to teach them, and that can be a large variety of things that we're going to teach them on. And so that's our thought today. And as ministers, we've got to learn so that we can then go and teach. And that's part of what we intend to do and hope to do here today and throughout this school. I was joking with Brother Miller there at lunch that he took us to the mountaintop just before lunch, and I hope that when you leave here, you don't say that Brother Chandler took us down a rabbit hole, because I am going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I guarantee you there's a rabbit down that hole. I guarantee you there is. And I thought as Brother Skinner was preaching this morning, and he brought up something, he said, now boy, isn't that rich? And it is rich. And it reminded me that I was helping in a revival down at West End a couple of years ago. And after the sermon, when somebody came up and said, boy, that was rich. And I said, well, I'm glad you said it was rich and not deep, because if it's deep, you left the treasure down there, because the treasure has to come out for it to be rich. And so we have to dig sometimes, and sometimes it's okay for us to go down a rabbit hole and search something out, because there is a treasure at the end of that if we will let the Lord lead us that way. Sometimes you may think you're never going to find anything, but boy, just keep digging. Just keep digging. Be like that dog that's looking for that bone. You know it's there, but it takes some time and it takes some effort. And don't be afraid to do that. And we need to do that. My reading lesson is going to come from Colossians in the second chapter, from the 8th through the 17th verse. It says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the traditions of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ. For in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and ye are complete in him, which is the head of all principalities and power, in whom also you are circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, and putting off of the body of sin of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, wherein also you are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised us from the dead, and you, being dead in your trespasses, and being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. And I tell you, the more I study about that Old Testament and their worship services and all of the things that was required of them, all the ordinances and commands that they have, folks, we live free. We live free. The Lord has blessed us to allow us to serve him without all the weight of that law upon us, because he took it. He took it. He took it. And we don't have to bear that, so we ought to be free to serve him. And having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Let no man, therefore, judge you in meat or in drink, or in respect of any holy day, or of the new moon, or of Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is Christ. And those last thoughts are where that I want to be. Those things were a shadow, but Christ is the body. Now, a shadow is a picture of something that is coming. And certainly in the Old Testament, we have those pictures painted everywhere that we look. Almost any subject that we pull out of the Old Testament, we can see Christ in it. Now, we're fortunate because that we've had so many have gone on before us that help open those things up, whereas those at the time of Jesus were still trying to interpret a lot of it, but they were looking for certain things. And that's why I heard my son talking to Brother Miller there at lunch, and it kind of reminded me, that's why Matthew, when he wrote the Gospel of Matthew, portrays Jesus as the King of the Jews, and fulfilling all of these prophecies. It was important for them to see that he was the reality of the picture. See, the picture is just an image that represents something else. And so that was our title is, Didn't You Get the Pictures I Sent You? Because he sent us pictures about everything about himself. But many times we either miss the picture or we don't quite understand it. Now, the reason for this lesson, and I may read a lot. When you get your notes, you'll see that there's a lot of pages here. A lot of it is scripture that I've inserted, but and a few other things. But there's a reason for this lesson. And the reason for this lesson is much of our organized religion, or organized special worship services, which we all have them. All of our churches have them. We have a special worship service that they're derived and centered around erroneously declared holidays established by the apostate church. Oh, that's a tough statement, but it's true. You all know that Christmas wasn't when Christ was born. There's no way of knowing that, and so we organize our services around them, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but are we going to live in the shadow or are we going to live in the reality? Where we're about to come into the Easter season. We organize our services around those, but how many of you know where Easter originated? How many of you really know what's behind all of that? We know that Christ was crucified at the Passover, and we know the lunar calendar and those kinds of things, but do we really recognize and understand and teach our people about these things, not to cause problems or to stir up problems. And I've worried about this ever since I've been preparing this lesson, because I don't want to create controversy or anything like that. But I would encourage you to search some of these things out. The problem with is that we are unconsciously, and I say this that we are unconsciously validating those pagan services and those things that have been put in there. Even though we put a Christian label on a lot of it, we're still validating the authors of those and much of the stuff that it's around it. And so we need to make a clear differentiation between what is traditional and what is spiritual, or what is that we've learned from our parents has been handed down to us, like our Christmas services, like our sunrise services. Those things are not commanded in the Scriptures. And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, but the next generation grows up and they think it's in the Scriptures unless we teach them differently. Unless we teach them, these things were entered in by tradition, but they're a good thing that we can go ahead and utilize and use as a springboard to teach and to uphold and to put forth Jesus Christ. So we need to make that differentiation. When I first started coming to the minister school, Brother H.C. Vanderpool taught a lesson on, is it spiritual or is it traditional? And it wasn't a type of a message that might get your emotions stirred up. But I tell you what, it sure got my mind stirred up and caused me to start searching to find out how much of the stuff that I was doing and thinking was scriptural was just really traditional. And so that's the reason for the lesson, is that we might make that differentiation. The overall aim of the lesson is to promote within each of us a Berean attitude, to be more noble than others. That's what it says about the Bereans in the book of Acts, that they were more noble than other people. How were they more noble? Receiving the word with all readiness of mind. They were willing. They were willing to receive it, but it didn't take somebody's word for it. Even the apostles that preached to them, it says, but they searched the Scriptures daily to see whether or not these things were so. And I'd encourage you that even though you come to the minister school and you put confidence in the teachers that are up here, go search those things out for yourself. Take these notes and search through them and see whether or not that they've been presented correctly. And some of these things are a little more out on the fringes, like we're going to be talking about today if we don't run out of time. It's all right to have an opinion. It's all right to search them out. It may not be certainly many of these things are not things that you want to be dogmatic about, but you need to have an idea. You need to know what you believe and why you believe it. It's just that simple. Now, the specific aim of the lesson, and here's where we start down the rabbit hole. The specific aim of the lesson is to expose the error of a Friday crucifixion by using biblical types, shadows, and eyewitness accounts, and at the same time, validating what Jesus said, which was that the proof of his messiahship rested on the picture of of Jonah in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. That's what Jesus said. He said, you want to know? Here's the picture. Look at it. Now, do you believe that Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of that fish? I do. Now, and I'll get into this just a little bit more in just a moment. But I believe that. But you all know as well as I do that there's no way that you can get 3 days and 3 nights from Friday till Sunday morning. There's got to be a better answer. Got to be a better answer. And I come back to the old, to what that we need to bear in mind, and that is, let God be true even if every man is a liar. And if everybody else has come up with something that don't make sense, then there's something wrong with it. I would venture to say there's not a one of you out there that hasn't asked that question. How can he have been buried 3 days and 3 nights from Friday till Sunday morning? It just doesn't add up. And if somebody in your church hasn't asked you that question, I'm sure that they'd like to, because it's a question that goes through every one of our minds. We'll get into that just a little bit more. What does the term Easter mean? We're talking about Easter. I assume that you all know that in the King James Version, the word Easter is used in the book of Acts, where that Herod was going to bring Peter out after Easter and to kill him, and they use the word Easter, but really the word is Passover. It's a bad translation, but it tells us something. It tells us that the translators of the Scriptures, that word meant something to them. Well, who did the translating? It was translated in Britain, in England, in 1611 by the translators who were members of most of them, I assume, were members of the Church of England, over which the king was the head of the church. And so much of their tradition was in there. I'll get to that in just a moment. What does the term Easter mean? It is not a Christian name. It bears its Chaldean origin on its very forehead. Easter is nothing else than Astarte, one of the titles of Beltis, the Queen of Heaven, whose name, as pronounced by the people of Nineveh, was identical with that now in common use in the country of Britain. That name, as found by Layard on the ancient Assyrian monuments, is Ishtar. The worship of Bel and Ishtar was very early introduced in Britain by the Druids, the priests of the groves. You'll find that in The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, and I recommend that book to you. It's hard reading, but you'll learn things that will lead you down some rabbit holes, but it will begin to open up to you how many of the things that got into our accepted holidays and our traditions, where they really come from. Now, you know as well as I do that God hated idolatry. He hated the worship of false gods, and we need to purge out every bit of that we can out of our services, or at least make our people aware of what's going on. The picture of Jonah. I'm running out of time fast. The picture of Jonah. Okay, what did Jesus say? Matthew 12th chapter, 38th verse. Then certain of the scribes and of the Pharisees answered, saying, Master, we would see a sign from thee. But he answered and said unto them, An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall be no sign be given but the sign of Jonah, of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the whole whale's belly, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now that came out of Jesus' mouth. He said that. He said that all of these other things out there, everything that's there, and you want a picture, A sign is a picture. I got a wedding ring on that hand, and that's a sign or a picture of the wedding that I'm engaged in, the covenant that I'm engaged in. All the pictures that Jesus sent forward, we could have picked out a study of the Levitical priesthood. We could have studied the robes of the high priest. We could have studied the high priest. We could have studied the tabernacle. We could study the offerings. We're going to study a little bit on the feast days, a little bit. But all of those were pictures that found their antitype in Jesus Christ when he came here. Matthew pulls that out. The book of Hebrews pulls it out emphatically, taking all those types and symbols and saying, yes, they were great, but Jesus is better. They were pictures, but here's Jesus. Why would you go to the picture when you got the reality? And so it's important for us to know these things. Now, the Jews, listen to this, the Jews say that for 3 days the soul goes to the grave, thinking the body may return, but when it sees the figure of the face changed, it goes away and leaves it as it is said in Job 14:22. So Jonah, being 3 days and 3 nights in the whale's belly, they say, these are the 3 days a man is in the grave, and his bowels burst, and after 3 days that defilement is turned upon his face. Hence, they do not allow anyone to bear witness to one that is dead or killed, that he is such and such a one, after 3 days, because then his countenance is changed and he cannot be well known. Now, that's a quote from John Gill on John 11:39, but it tells us, it's a quote from the Jewish rabbis and the beliefs that they had. Those 3 days and 3 nights were important to them. They were wrong in their assumption that the soul didn't leave the body until after 3 days, but that was a custom and what they believed, and so the fact of a body being in the grave for a full 3 days was important to them. That's why when Jesus was out and he heard word that Lazarus has died, it says that he stayed there and tarried a little bit longer because he had something he wanted to show them. And we know that when he finally got there, what did the sisters say to him? They said, he's been dead 4 days and he stinketh. That's because that fourth day, no one was to look upon them. Those graves were to never be opened. You could open them before the 3 days, if necessary, to make an identification. So the Jews, in their minds, that 3 days and 3 nights was important to them. It was important to them because no doubt that they believed that if someone came back to life after 2 days, it was possible. They wouldn't credit that with any miracle. But certainly anyone after 3 days and 3 nights that came back from the dead would be something that would be a sign, something that they didn't believe that was certainly superhuman, beyond human capability. And so, again, that's an important thing for us to understand. Now, the difficulty with the Friday crucifixion, Sunday resurrection is, and you all can figure it out, the timeline just doesn't work. I mean, it just doesn't work. If he was crucified on Friday at 3 o'clock, died at 3 o'clock, and was in the tomb by 6 o'clock, which we know, and we'll see a little bit more of that as we go along, that if you counted them up, what have you got? You got Friday night, that's one night. You got Saturday, that's 1 day. You got Saturday night, that's 2 nights. And even if you count a piece of Sunday as another day, you still don't have 3 days and 3 nights. Now, I'm sure you've all done this math, but have you just stopped there and taken the old idea that's been put forward? And that is, well, any part of a day counts as a day. It doesn't matter if it's an hour because, well, since he died at 3 o'clock and he was in the tomb before 6, even if he was in there just for a half hour or so, that counts as a day. Well, you know, time just doesn't work that way. But that makes it easy to explain, and we're going to see why that they do that here in just a moment. And so the Good Friday Easter, the Good Friday crucifixion, resurrection on Sunday morning just doesn't work. There's no way you can do the math and get 3 days, 3 12-hour periods, and 3 night periods. You just can't do it. You all know that. So there's got to be another answer. There's an important statement in John 20, chapter 20, verse 1. It says, the first day of the week, cometh Mary Magdalene early when it is yet dark. When it is yet dark. Hadn't even dawned on the daylight yet, so you can't count that as part of a day even. You got to count that as part of the night. So now you got Friday night and Saturday night, and that's it, 2 nights. You can't even count part of that day. So the scripture is quite clear, and John specifically, if you read John's accounts, he gives us a lot of detail that you don't get into some of the other Gospels, but those are important details. And so John tells us that it was before daylight. Now, we have our sunrise services, and we instill in our minds the idea that he came up right after the sun did, but not according to John. According to John, before it was ever daylight, he was already gone. He wasn't in there. That becomes important for us. So, the first thing we need to understand, and there's a picture of this. Let's understand, get a clear picture of God's time. God's time. God's time is important because this is the Son of God. And all these things are centered around God. And the first thing that we need to understand, and probably all of you know this, is that we don't count time the same way that the Jews did. We start our day at midnight, and we count forward from midnight at the beginning of the day, but that's not where they started their day. They started their day in the evening when the sun went down and it was dark. That was the beginning of the day. God lays that out in the very beginning of the Scriptures, back in Genesis, so that we have a clear understanding of what a day is. What does it say in Genesis 1:5? And God called the light portion day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning, and they called the daylight portion morning, and so the evening and the morning were the first day. And he repeats it 6 times. He repeats it 6 times in Genesis 1 as he created things. So we clearly understand that God's time starts in the evening, not at midnight like we count time. And so that's important for us to understand. Jesus defines a daylight period as 12 hours. The incident I talked about Lazarus, when Jesus got ready to go to Bethany, the disciples, many of them didn't want him to go for fear of the Jews because they were already on the lookout for him. They were already looking for an opportunity to slay him, and so they didn't want him to go. But Jesus said, there's work that needs to be done. There's things you need to see. And he says this. He says, are there not 12 hours in the day? If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light of the world. But if a man walketh in the night, he stumbleth, because there's no light in him. So Jesus said a daylight of a day is 12 hours. And so that's from like 6 o'clock in the morning when the sun comes up till 6 o'clock in the evening when the sun goes down, and they begin a new day. They didn't have daylight savings time. And so with just slight variation to that time, 6 o'clock in the evening began their day, and the first 12 hours of darkness was that first night. And then the next 12 hours of daylight was the daylight portion of it. And so we know that, but most of the confusion comes in the Roman time. Because that we don't use the same time scale. Now, I'm going to bring out a little what you might call a discrepancy, what some might call a discrepancy. But we know that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that as they report the incident of Jesus's being before Pilate and being put on the cross, they report it as that he was put on the cross in the 3rd hour. Well, what would be the 3rd hour? The 3rd hour would be 9 a.m. because they started their day at 6 a.m. and so it was the 3rd hour of the day. Now John, when he's writing, he says something that's a little bit different. What John says is that he was before Pilate, and Pilate had given him over to be crucified at the 9th hour. Well, there's a logical explanation for that. John wrote his gospel around 80 A.D., roughly that era. He lived in Ephesus, most scholars agree, when he wrote it. And his audience was Roman. not necessarily Jewish at all, and so it's not uncommon for him to use an hour that they would recognize. And so there's really no discrepancy, because the ninth hour to a Roman is 9 o'clock in the morning. The ninth since the midnight hour would be 9 o'clock in the morning. But the important thing for you to do when you have a question like that is lay those Gospels side by side. Get you a good harmony, or if you don't have one and can't get one, then you go and write those scriptures down and lay them side by side, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what you'll see is the events. The events correspond from what John said with exactly with what Matthew, Mark, and Luke said. And so we find no inconsistency at all, even though that there is a little bit of fuzziness in the way that the time seems to be recorded, but it really makes perfect sense when you understand who John was writing to and what he was doing. Now, I've inserted into your notes a little copy of that laid side by side so that you can see the hours in Jewish time and the hours in Roman time, and you'll see how that they correspond. And so that's the first picture that we got to look at. And got to get clear in our mind that the scriptures are written to the Jews using their time, and we have to understand these things as we begin to try to interpret when these events occurred. Now, the other thing, the next picture that I noted is a picture that I believe is misread. And that is that there are two kinds of Sabbaths. There are two kinds of Sabbath. Most people don't know that. Most people believe that when you say the Sabbath, you're talking about Saturday Sabbath. And I believe that's where they got in trouble to start with and how it ended up where it is, because they weren't Jews, the people who put this in effect and began to celebrate the crucifixion on Friday. I think they didn't do a good job of their research, but they weren't Jewish. They didn't operate on Jewish time. They operated on Roman time because it was the Roman Catholic Church that put it into effect. But most people don't understand that there's two kinds of Sabbaths. The reasons I say for the Friday date for the crucifixion is because that Saturday was the Sabbath. And so he had to be in the tomb before the Sabbath dawned. But was it the weekly Sabbath? That's the real question. Was it the weekly Sabbath that they were trying to get him into the tomb before that it dawned? It really wasn't. It really wasn't the weekly Sabbath. Let's read a couple of scriptures here. Mark 15:42 states that it was the preparation day, the day before the Sabbath. And now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also awaited for the kingdom of God, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Jesus. Well, now, in the normal weekly Sabbath cycle, that would be Friday. That'd be the day before the Sabbath. But there's other things that we learn, and so people err. They see the picture is misread if they think because it said the Sabbath that is necessarily talking about Friday, because there's other things that you need to know, and the pictures are clear back in the Old Testament, but you got to go back there to find them. You got to go back there to find them, and they are there. And I mean, quickly move along. So let's move into the feasts of the Lord. Let's move into the feast of the Lord. I want to read this for you out of Leviticus, and I can see there's no way I'm going to get done. But the notes are very detailed. I'm a detailed person. You're going to go down a rabbit hole. I mean, you better be prepared for some detail. And so there's details in here that I'd encourage you to follow, and you think it out for yourself. But I want to read this to you out of Leviticus because this is where the timeline and the kinds of Sabbath fall in, and we begin to understand this. And it's extremely important if the pictures that God painted with those feasts, if they were fulfilled in Jesus Christ and His death and resurrection, it's extremely important that we understand them. You can find these holy days. That's why I read out of Colossians to start with about the holy days. You can find their observation and all these things scattered throughout the Old Testament. But there's only one place that you'll find that they are listed in order and exactly how they fell. 23rd chapter of the book of Leviticus. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Lord, Now, notice it says, concerning the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be a holy convocation, even these are my feasts. And then it says what? The weekly Sabbath. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwelling. So we know that they observed every seventh day as a Sabbath of rest. It was a holy convocation. But that wasn't the only one that they had. They had others. And the way that their calendar fell, that in the spring of the calendar, the spring of the year, they had 3 feasts that were right together. And then they had the Feast of Pentecost, which we'll get to, maybe. And then at the tail end, they had 3 other feasts that fell together in the fall of the year. And all of these, within them, were holy convocations, days that you did no work, days that you were not to light a fire, you were not to travel, you were to observe it that way. So, these are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their season. We're going to hear the first 2. The 14th day of the month at even is the Lord's Passover. 14th day of the month at evening is the Lord's Passover. At evening, now when's that? That's the beginning of the day. They observed it in the evening at the beginning of the day. And so they were to have that Passover meal at the beginning of the 14th of Nisan, or Abib, as is sometimes said. Nisan is a Chaldean translation of Abib, the Hebrew Abib. And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein, but you shall offer an offering made by the fire unto the Lord 7 days. And the 7th day of the holy convocation you shall do no servile work therein. Did you see what just happened? 2 Sabbath days in a row. 2 Sabbath days in a row. There was the Passover, then there was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the 14th and 15th. So you had 2 days that they were not to be about servile work. They were not to go forward and do anything. It wasn't just the weekly Sabbath. This always fell this way, 2 Sabbaths in a row. Now, if Saturday was the Sabbath that Jesus was first in the tomb, and it was the 14th, the Passover day, then Sunday would have been as well. And the women wouldn't have gone to the tomb because they couldn't have gone in and anointed his body. So there's a real dilemma from our perspective. If you only think that the only Sabbath is on Saturday, the Saturday Sabbath is a real dilemma from our perspective to try to figure out how you get 2 Sabbaths in there. But always there were these 2 Sabbaths in a row. Speaking to the children of Israel and saying to them, when you come into the land which I give unto you and shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruit of your harvest unto the priest. Now wait a minute, this is a different holy day. The feast of the first fruit. When was it? Well, it's going to tell us when it was. And you shall wave the sheep before the Lord to be accepted unto you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. The morrow after what Sabbath? Well, you see, they're already into the week of Passover. Passover, the word Pascha, which is used, can mean the lamb itself. It can mean the festival itself. It can mean the day. You can look that up. And so they use that term interchangeably. But that's what he's talking about. He's talking about on the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And he shall offer that day when you wave the sheaf of the lamb without blemish on the first year of a burnt offering to the Lord. And the meat offering thereof shall be 2/10 deal of the flour mingled with oil, an offering made by fire unto the Lord for a sweet savor. I'm going to stop there. And so we have the Feast of the First Fruit. When was it observed? It was observed on the Sabbath after the Feast of First Fruit had started. In that week, wherever that you come up to the Sabbath day, and he's talking about the weekly Sabbath, when you come up to the Sabbath day, the next day would be the Feast of the First Fruit that the wave offering was offered. That would be the day that Mary Magdalene and the others went to the tomb, because that was the day after the weekly Sabbath, falling in the week of the Passover and Feast of First Fruit. That's an important day. Now, other things happened from that day. Now, you say, well, how do you know that it was that day? Well, we're going to find out here. Let's get down to the next part of that chapter, which is the Feast of Weeks, we know as Pentecost. And it gives us a time schedule. it gives us a time schedule of how they know when the Feast of Pentecost is going to be. And it's tied back to when the Feast of the Wave Offering, the Feast of First Fruits is given. And you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, the day that you offer the wave offering. From that day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. 7 weeks from that day after you offered it, even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you shall number 50 days. 50 days. That's how you get the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Pentecost. We know that Jesus was with his disciples after his resurrection 40 days. We know that then he ascended back, where they went to an upper room, and then when the Feast of Pentecost was fully come, that the Holy Spirit was given. And so the day on which that they observed the Feast of First Fruit is important because it was always the day after the weekly Sabbath in the week of Passover and the first fruits. Now, you can go back and check history. You can go back and read all the Jewish writings. You'll find that they disagreed about these things, some. Some promoted that, no, it was supposed to be the day after the observance of the Feast of First Fruit on the first day of Holy Convocation. But the Sadducees were in charge of the temple. And it's unquestionable in all historians and in all the writings that I could find that the Sadducees strictly observed the Feast of First Fruits on the day after the weekly Sabbath in the week of Pentecost, or in the week of Passover. And so that puts us now to the point where that we've got 3 Sabbaths in that week, because we know that it was after the weekly Sabbath that Jesus resurrected as the first fruits. And so there's the problem. I should say there's the answer. The reason that they couldn't go to the tomb was that there were 3 Sabbaths all in a row. We know that Jesus was on that cross before that the Passover began. He was the Passover offering. The Passover offering was offered normally between 2:30 and 3:30. Again, go look this up in some of the writings of people who have captured this. The offering was offered between 2:30 and 3 o'clock, and that it was offered in the temple, rather, it was slain and then offered by 3:30. We know from the specific time in the Scripture that Mark says, and that he gave up the ghost, and it was about the 9th hour. The 9th hour from where? From in the morning at 6 o'clock. From 6 in the morning till 6 noon is 6 hours. And from noon to 3 o'clock is another 3 hours. And that's consistent with when they made the Passover offering. It's consistent that his death was. And then they hurried to get him off of the cross and into the tomb, because it was the day of preparation. What was about to happen? They were about to go into a long period of Sabbaths in which that nothing could be done, and so they hurriedly took Jesus and wrapped him and put him in that tomb. The women made note of it. I'm just going to have to preach now and just quit looking at my notes. That they hurriedly wrapped him, put him in that tomb, because John says it, because the Sabbath wore on. It was coming down to the hour in which they had to be in their homes. They had to be to where that they couldn't do any servile work. And so as they got Jesus into that tomb, I can just hear the ram's horns blowing as they went to their homes and began the observance of the Passover while that Jesus was put in the tomb. And for 3 days and 3 nights, while these 3 Sabbaths were being observed, the Passover Sabbath, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits, while they were being observed, Jesus lay in that tomb. The women could go do nothing, and the time passed. And what Jesus said was that as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. We know that when the women went to get him to anoint his body, that he was already up. He was already gone before the sun ever came up. Those 3 days and those 3 nights had passed. I don't know when he rose, but I can tell you it was sometime after 6 o'clock, after the sun went down on Saturday evening. What he did during those 12 hours, I don't know. It's probably none of my business. But he was up. He was gone. What happened at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening? The Sabbaths ended. Matter of fact, if you look at Matthew, when it says that the women went on the Sabbath, the word's plural. It's not singular, it's plural. The Sabbaths had ended, and the women went to the tomb, and he was already up and already gone. And what had happened? As it began to dawn, we were already into that 17th day. That 17th day. Now, that's an important day. That's an important day, the 17th, because that's when the Feast of First Fruits was observed that week. Now, I'm out of time already. You just have to look at the notes. Please look at my notes. There's a couple of things that I want to put in there, though, because God doesn't do anything without a purpose. He gives us dates. He gives us numbers. He gives us information to paint pictures. As I studied this and I went back and I kept remembering that date of the 17th. On the 17th, it kept jogging my memory. So I went back and began to read about Noah. And how that Noah had, for a whole year, that the flood had come, and that Noah was in the ark and his family, and they were up on the flood. And then it tells us that in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, that he landed on Ararat. You know what? You know when the 7th month was? For Noah, the 7th month would have been what the first month is for them now, because God made a calendar change. He made it in the book of Exodus in the 12th chapter when he gave them the feast of the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. He said, "You shall observe this in the month of Abib, which shall now be your first month," which previously had been their 7th month, because they started their calendar in the fall instead of in the spring. And so now what do we see happening? We see that picture of Noah coming through all of that wrath of God, and we see Noah finally coming to solid ground on the 17th of the month of Abib, just as Jesus came out as the first fruit on that 17th morning, victorious over all of the wrath of God upon sin, and he suffered it for us. Oh, what a picture. Yeah, we might go down a rabbit hole, but I guarantee you there's a rabbit down there. There's a treasure down there. Don't be afraid to question tradition. My time is way up. Don't be afraid to question tradition. Read these notes. Look, search it out yourself. It may take you a while, but you'll find at the end of the day, you may not agree with me that it was on a Wednesday that he was crucified and died. You may come up with a Thursday. I don't see how, in all honesty, you can come up with a Friday. I just don't see how you can do it. But I'd rather take Jesus at his word and then see how everything else fits, because it was a pretty important statement that he made. He said, the Son of Man, that he gives you no picture, no sign but this, the prophet Jonah, that is, he was 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus defined a day as 12 hours. The night period was 12 hours. I don't believe you can take a piece of Friday and a piece of Sunday and count them as a day. And you don't need to. You don't need to, because God already gave us the picture. If we'll just look at the picture that's there and let him discern it for us. I appreciate your time. I apologize for going over a little bit. Please take a look at these notes.